The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with, even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the 7th and final day of this 7-day sesshin here in July 2019 at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico. And we'll continue to share the teachings of Huang Po, the Tang Dynasty Chan master, also known as Obaku in Japanese. And this is from a new translation by Robert Buswell, who's an eminent Buddhist scholar. Prior to that, he was a Buddhist monk in a Korean monastery in Korea. This book, A Bird in Flight Leaves No Trace, is also including commentary by a contemporary Son master, that's the Korean Zen master, Subil Sunim. But we're mainly concerned with Huang Po's deep teaching, and they're deep teaching. In many ways, it's just a different way of speaking the Prajnaparamita, the core teaching of the Buddha. Form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. Feeling, thought, and choice, consciousness itself are the same as this. These are the kinds of things he says. And out of his deep understanding, as the Buddha said, out of his own deep understanding, and how we also can deeply realize the same truth. And when we do, our life is transformed. Of course, we also have to do the long maturation process, which is to deal with letting go of our habit patterns of greed, anger, and delusion. All of us have them. And they create a situation for us, or I should say we create through them a situation in which there is a challenge in life, sometimes downright suffering, sometimes there's some peace and some happiness, and then sometimes there's some challenge. It's all a mixed bag. If we're fortunate, it's a mixed bag, and it's not wholly suffering, although for some people it is. And there is a way out of the suffering. And that suffering is through deep introspection. It doesn't necessarily have to be Buddhist introspection. It can even be Christian. There are plenty of saints in the history of Christianity who have achieved what in Buddhism would be considered to be deep enlightenment experiences. John of the Cross is one. Meister Eckhart is another. And if you read their writings, their teachings, assuming they're translated by somebody who has shared those experiences, and this is a critical part because many teachings of enlightened people are translated by people who have not had those experiences, not reached that depth of understanding as the people that they're trying to translate. And so they read a lot of things into the words that they're translating, and the result is a very inaccurate, usually quite superficial translation. So you always have to look when you're about to read a book that seems to be pointing in a direction that's deep. You always have to take a look at if it's been translated, or if it's been written, for that matter, who the writer, who the translator is, and what is their background. Have they seen deeply enough to really know what they're talking about, or not? It's sort of like if you're going to build a house, and you don't know how to build a house, so you're going to read a lot of books about how to build a house, because there's nobody else that can do it. And you can read of the experiences of master builders. you can also read of the ideas of people who know nothing at all about building but pretend that they do. I know in the Rochester Zen Center many, many years ago, there was a transition point. Most of the people that were at the center training when I went there to train myself were people, young people who had come right out of college, or in some cases right out of high school, and had no world experience in terms of work out in the world, experience out in the world. They'd come from family life to the Zen Center. And then at a certain point, it was really interesting to see, about 10 years into their time at the Rochester Zen Center, suddenly people started getting married and needing jobs because they were starting to have children as well. And so some of them went out and got jobs that were in existence. Others created their own jobs. Some of those jobs were quite successful, but there were some, and I can think of one person in particular, who sort of invented ways to do construction that were not at all, well, they were logical according to his way of thinking, but in terms of construction logic, they were completely out to lunch. And when he started working in historical homes, it got even worse. We have to know who we're listening to, whether it's in a recording, whether it's in a book, whether it's in a teisho, so that we can get a sense of how legitimate that person might be. And of course, in the background of it all is our own ideas about ourselves, which also we project onto other people and other situations. The bottom line really is to become as clear as possible. And then you can discern what's appropriate, what's not, what's correct, what's not, and so forth. It goes a long way down because we act out of our assumptions, out of our conditioning, and we have conditioning that we've drawn conclusions about that we don't want to own. And we find ourselves, without realizing it, acting out in the very ways we don't want to own, and projecting those ways onto other people, and reacting to those other people who really aren't doing those things in those ways as if they were. And it creates disharmony. People can get very angry. A few moments ago, I was outside with our terrific guys who are, at the moment, building us a sidewalk so that we don't have to slog through the mud to the garage. And they were talking about, one of them had worked with a contractor who was furious all the time, yelling at people all the time. He eventually died of a heart attack, actually, which is not a surprise in a certain way, because the stress of being so angry, so constantly angry, and so acting out on the anger, it takes a toll on the body. He didn't know why the guy was so angry all the time, but he was. As part of our coming to awakening, and this is something many people miss, we open to where we are caught. We open to where we are acting in less than optimal ways, less than kind ways, less than generous ways, less than let go ways, where our habit patterns of greed, anger, and delusion are being acted out. And with that awareness, if we choose to walk right into these experiences and own them, not to try to avoid them, not to do, as John Wellwood points out, an end run around our issues, a spiritual bypassing, then we have a chance to become free of them. And letting go each of these things that we see brings us to a more clear place. And for one thing, we're much less likely, if we really do willingly own the dysfunction, we're much less likely to indulge in it in an ongoing way. We don't want to act like that. And we don't want to act like that enough that we simply choose not to. That's easy when we can see it. It's impossible when we can't see it. We usually just blame the other guy. Some people have even been known to come to awakening without benefit of any religious structure. There aren't so many of them. Very, very, very few. I think of two that I know of, one personally, who is Flora Courtois, and then there's Jacques Lucéron, who died quite a while ago. He only lived to be in his mid-40s, and then he and his wife were killed in a car accident. But after he had his deep awakening in Buchenwald prison, concentration camp, the rest of his life was filled with joy. Joy that never left him. The sixth patriarch had an awakening experience. Each of these experiences, however, didn't just come out of the air. It came after long hours, days, months, years even, of questioning. Of questioning reality. Of searching for what is sensed to be beyond intellectual knowledge, beyond words at all. Fortunately, we have a long history in Buddhism of teachings that help us to do that with a teacher. And it's important to be with a teacher because it's way too easy to misguide ourselves, to delude ourselves. There are strong and long periods during practice where we may think we've had an opening, and a kensho, an awakening even, when it really wasn't that at all. So it's important to work with a teacher so that they can help guide us. A teacher is simply one who has gone a few steps ahead of anyone who chooses that person as a teacher, and so they have some experience with the path. There's nothing special about being a teacher, believe me. So let's share some more of Huang Po. Yesterday, we read this part. Most ordinary people allow the perceptual environment to obstruct their minds and ephemeral phenomena to obstruct the unchanging principle. They always seek to flee phenomena in order to pacify their minds, and to reject phenomena in order to preserve the principle. And then it continues. They do not know that it is in fact the mind that obstructs the perceptual environment and principle that obstructs phenomena. Here, I think what he means by mind is the self-image and all that goes with that. We act out of, we speak out of, we think out of this assumption, this set of assumptions of who we are. When you just empty your mind, the perceptual environment naturally becomes empty of itself. If you allow the principle to remain tranquil, phenomena will become tranquil naturally. do not use the mind in the opposite way. Ordinary people, by and large, are unwilling to empty their minds for fear that they will fall into emptiness. We're so afraid to let go what we don't even realize we're hanging on to, which is this self-image. People go around through their lives, most people, as a persona, with a mask. And they act out of that persona because they assume that's who they are. That mask is who they think they are. It's not. It's their accumulation of conditioning and assumptions, predictions, and so on, based on their experience. So who is the real person? Comprehending this is what will set us free. And as we do the extended out breath, we need to, in order to extend it, let go of other things and be intimately present with the moment as it is, with the bodily experience of breathing out as it is. There's no room for thinking, ideas, maintaining a self-image. We are the breath itself. And that is liberating. And as we do it again and again, little by little, it makes inroads into those assumptions. We begin to let go bits and pieces of the persona. As we begin to let go bits and pieces of the persona, fear can come up, exactly because of what Huang Po says. We're afraid of falling into emptiness. If we don't act according to how we think we are we going to not know how to behave? Are we going to run naked out into the streets? As when I was in 6th grade, our next door neighbor who was schizophrenic did. That was a different situation. She was mentally ill. To be completely sane and to let go. The anxiety still can come up. But if we embrace the anxiety and allow ourselves to feel it fully, oh my, it's amazing what we can discover. In a very small way, Albert Einstein made his great discoveries in science in the same way. He let go, for the moment, who he was, and allowed his mind to freely move. And it came up with deep understandings scientifically. Otherwise, I gather he was a fairly self-centered gentleman. But when we are willing to let go, and often if our lives have been so painful, we're willing to do it because what's a little bit more pain? Particularly if it can lead to freedom. And freedom it will lead to if we persist. At some level we sense this, or we wouldn't be sitting here for 7 days, sitting long hours in unmoving positions, eating at regimented times, working at regimented times, not really getting to do what we feel like all the time. And it is productive. It helps us let go. The whole framework of Zen practice and living in a Zen monastery is such that we more easily uncover where we're caught. It's easy to see. I don't like sitting here all these long hours. Why can't I talk? Why can't I just do what I feel like? Why can't I just walk out of the zendo anytime I feel like it? Well, if you do that, you're not going to receive the benefit of the practice. It won't take you to that freedom because you're putting up a barrier to it. And because it's clear that you're not really interested in practice, at least not at that point, chances are you won't come to another sesshin. This practice isn't for everyone, but for those of us that stick it out, even when it's difficult, even when it's frustrating, even when it's frightening, the freedom that we can open to is phenomenal and beyond description. Moreover, it's the only real freedom there is in life. Freedom to respond without having to do it out of a set of charades, out of a script that we've written, but to really respond and not to react. There's tremendous freedom in this, because when we do it as a result of some level of awakening, in my experience at least, it's right. How we respond brings forth positive results. It's not like just, as the Beat generation assumed, going out and doing whatever you feel like doing. No, our innate sense of ethics, our innate compassion and wisdom are able to be free to function then, more fully than when we have them captured and encaged in this assumption of who we think we are, in this self-image. Freedom is incredible, which is why for more than 2,500 years, the teachings have been taught to lead people to that freedom, that innate freedom. Each of us has to do it ourselves. Having a guide makes a difference. Being able to be in the environment, for example, a sesshin, or ongoing monastic training, whether you're a monk or not, has tremendous benefits. There's no prescribed way we have to live. And it's interesting to note that in the West, the whole tradition of monastic training has diminished significantly. Most of the Zen teachers are lay teachers. Very few of them are even ordained. And those who are ordained, very few of them actually live in and run monasteries. The Western way seems more to be like Hakuin was speaking of, practice in the midst of activity. It's harder. We don't have the environment that is precisely established to encourage practice and to support practice. We're out there among the wolves, and we're trying to support a family, or trying to support ourselves, or trying to go through life in the midst of society and come to awakening at the same time. It's not an easy task, but as we persist, our reaching that level will be solid and deep. Jack Cornfield, who spent 5 years in a forest monastery in jungles of Thailand, largely on his own, because even though he was in a community of monks, they each lived in their own little kuti, it's called, a little hut. They came together for meals, they came together for talks with the master, in this case Ajahn Chah, and on other occasions. But most of the time they were on their own, doing their practice, sweeping the paths, sitting in meditation. And after 5 years, he felt like he'd gotten it down. He was free. And so he returned to New York City, and bam, society hit him right in the face. And he discovered he wasn't at all free, that he hadn't encountered his, as Jisan would call it, stuck places while he was living in the monastery, because they weren't triggered. Once he got back into society, they were triggered all over the place. And so he became a clinical psychologist. He went back to school, became a clinical psychologist to learn how to address these issues. And he also became a Buddhist teacher. Some traditionalists will scoff at the idea of incorporating psychology into Zen practice. And yet, at least in our Western cultures, we grow up in ways that we incorporate misunderstanding, dysfunctional behavior, in a word, greed, anger, and delusion, in our personalities. And the practice, while it will allow us to see through, or I should say it allows us to see where we're caught, sometimes we need some outside help to manage the real letting go of it. And I particularly emphasize this in the case of anyone who's experienced trauma. Trauma is a serious event. It impacts us physically, mentally, emotionally, psychologically. And sometimes it takes big guns to help ourselves reach a place where at least the impact of it is diminished. Zazen, seen through the eyes of the traditional Japanese culture, which is so very different, there's no need to do any psychology work. If you do enough Zazen, it takes care of all of it. Well, it'll take care of a lot of it, but there's certain things that it is much more helpful to have some outside expert help to work through. And then your practice can go much deeper, and it will go deeper faster if you make use of that outside help. This is important to recognize. In the 1950s, there was real negative feeling about psychology. In fact, when I was about to marry a man whose father was a psychologist, he was a psychology professor at Indiana University, actually, and my parents were highly suspicious of this. From their perspective, you don't tell anybody anything about yourself or your family or anything else. Well, it turns out that Douglas Elson actually was a specialist in learning psychology, which meant he studied rats in mazes and studied how children learned, and actually was very instrumental in creating a series of textbooks to teach migrant children how to read, not in See Jane Run, See Spot Bark, and all of the things that were in these little books that I supposedly learned to read in, and most people don't. learn to read. I already knew how to read before I got to that level. He discovered that if they were short paragraphs that were actually stories, the kids got it much faster. And he created a series of textbooks that, because the migrant children were migrating multiple times during their school year, if they were available in the migrant states, then the child could just take off and continue on in the next school with where he or she had been learning previously, and could get quite good at reading. That was his field. But even Mitra-roshi, who was, of course, the same generation, he was born a year after my father was born, was also quite suspicious of psychology, and had, in the early years, nothing positive to say about it. He was suspicious of psychologists who he was afraid were pretending to be Zen masters when they really didn't have enough understanding to really fill that role. But eventually he gave a talk at Omega Institute to a whole bunch of psychologists, and discovered that they were eager to learn how to practice. They weren't interested in teaching their clients Zen necessarily. They were learning how to free themselves so they could become better psychologists. And more or less around the same time, some of his students who were having some psychological challenges decided on their own to go into therapy, and he was surprised and impressed by how positively that impacted their zazen and their Zen practice. Psychology will take a person to a certain point. It will not take a person as deep as Zen practice will. But sometimes together, they're quite a team. It's important to open to the full catastrophe, as Zorba the Greek said at one point, and not to try to deny or shelve or shove under the carpet any issues we might have, any sticky places we might have, but rather to open to them so that they can be released and we can move on free of them. This is the long maturation that Hakuin's premier student, Torei Enji, emphasized. The practice is about coming to awakening, and having had some insight, one then begins to work on subsequent koans, which expand and deepen that insight and hopefully also open one to yet deeper Kensho experiences, ongoing. And at the same time, the practice will reveal where we're caught. And it's up to us to take advantage of that insight and free ourselves, to let go the dysfunction, so that our innate compassion and wisdom can fully be revealed and lived. So, as you're doing the out-breath, as you're doing your wordless questioning, opening to the yearning to know who you really are. If something comes up and you have an insight into some way you've been behaving that is not a happy one, turn and face it, embrace it, feel the regret, feel the remorse, feel how it feels to realize that you've been acting like that way. And when you feel it fully, completely, it will shift and there will be a sense of release. And it'll be so much easier then not to act in that way. And little by little become free. And it frees you also to go much more deeply into this practice, which itself is inherently freeing. We only have a few more hours left, but as was said yesterday, it's a potent time, an incredibly potent time. You've done significant work. Every single one of you here in this session has done significantly deeper work as the days have gone by. So, your ability to continue going even more deeply has magnified. Take advantage of that. Go for the gold. It'll be worth it. I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.